History buried kingdoms, yet it could never silence the rulers who once held the world in their hands. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. Masako Owada was born in Tokyo in 1963 into a family that valued education, diplomacy, and global fluency. Her father, Hisashi Owada, was a rising diplomat in Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His postings abroad meant that Masako's childhood was split between Moscow, New York, and Tokyo, shaping her worldview early through language, observation, and exposure to international affairs. She moved fluidly between cultures and carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone raised not on tradition, but on adaptability. Her academic path reflected this trajectory. After returning to Japan for high school, she enrolled at Harvard University in 1981, focusing on economics. There, she developed a reputation not for rebellion or charisma, but for precise intelligence and quiet strength. Professors noted her seriousness. Peers remembered her as distant but deliberate. Upon graduation in 1985, she briefly studied at Oxford, then returned to Tokyo to join the Foreign Ministry. She passed the entrance exam on her first try, a notable feat for a woman at the time, and became a diplomatic trainee with a specialization in international treaties. Her language skills, command of Western diplomacy, and emotional restraint made her stand out in a male-dominated environment, but not without friction. She was young, female, and elite, a combination that drew both praise and pressure. Her career was not merely a job. It was a path designed to place her at the center of Japan's emerging global identity in the late Cold War period. Her visibility attracted the attention of more than just ministry officials. The Imperial Household Agency, an opaque institution tasked with preserving the rituals and image of Japan's monarchy, had begun quietly vetting potential brides for Crown Prince Naruhito. As the heir apparent, Naruhito's future consort was expected to fulfill symbolic roles, produce a male heir, and maintain an image of serene obedience within a structure that had remained unchanged for centuries. The agency saw in Masako the education and poise needed to modernize the imperial image, without actually shifting its internal logic. She was summoned for an introduction, unofficial at first, and met Naruhito at a court function in 1986. Their brief meeting made headlines years later, but at the time, it did not lead to immediate courtship. Masako was still focused on her diplomatic career, and she quietly returned to her duties while resisting repeated overtures from the palace. For nearly 6 years, Masako refused to enter the imperial system. Concerns over her freedom, the loss of career, and the narrowing of her identity weighed heavily. But the pressure was unrelenting. The agency persisted. The prince persisted. The narrative that took shape in the press was one of romance and devotion. But behind closed doors, it was also one of negotiation, hesitation, and institutional expectation. In 1992, she withdrew from a key diplomatic posting that would have sent her to the United States. The timing was not accidental. Around this same period, it became known that she would accept the courtship and eventual engagement to Naruhito. Publicly, the decision was framed as a personal choice. Privately, it was a decision that marked the end of Masako's public autonomy. Once accepted into the inner circle of the imperial family, the rules shifted. Her movements became monitored. Her future roles were predetermined. The press coverage intensified, casting her alternately as a modernizing hope and a reluctant bride. The narrative was not hers to write. On January 19th, 1993, the engagement was formally announced. The ceremony was accompanied by official rituals, televised broadcasts, and a public hungry for symbolism. Masako's face, previously familiar in diplomatic photos, now appeared across screens and magazines in a different context, not as a professional, but as a princess-to-be. Her education, her travels, her diplomatic training, none of it disappeared, but all of it became background to a new role that centered her proximity to a centuries-old institution and a man whose destiny she was expected to support. The wedding took place on June 9th, 1993, within the grounds of the Imperial Palace. It was conducted with traditional rites and national coverage. Millions watched as she entered the court in ceremonial attire, now formally severed from the career she had once prioritized. The moment was celebrated across Japan, but beneath the surface, it signaled a quiet submission to structure over self. She became Crown Princess Masako, not as a figure of power, but as a symbol of continuity. From that day forward, every step, smile, and silence would be measured against the needs of an institution that did not bend. Her former colleagues in the foreign ministry were not invited. Her passport was revoked. Her titles changed. The life of Masako Owada, the diplomat, had ended, and the life of Empress-in-waiting had begun. From the moment Masako crossed into the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace, the nature of her life changed. Her schedule no longer belonged to her. Her words were not her own. Even her expressions, gestures, and manner of standing were monitored, recorded, and shaped to align with the expectations of the Imperial Household Agency, or Kunaicho. This organization, established to maintain the rituals, dignity, and image of Japan's imperial family, operated with strict secrecy and absolute authority. Unlike the modern bureaucracies Masako had navigated at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Kunaicho had no interest in merit or debate. Its task was not to govern people, but to preserve symbols. And in that structure, Masako was no longer a diplomat with a voice. She had become a vessel. The transition was immediate. Upon marriage, she lost her passport and her right to vote. Her contact with the outside world narrowed. Her opinions on politics, social issues, or even daily life were never to be voiced publicly. Her life was now ceremonial. Her presence was to be seen, not heard. At first, she complied. She greeted visiting dignitaries with grace, attended imperial rituals in prescribed dress, and appeared beside Crown Prince Naruhito with studied composure. But behind her rehearsed smile, the strain surfaced quickly. The Kunaicho's internal rules were rigid but unwritten. They were communicated not through policy, but through correction, quiet reprimands, orchestrated silences, carefully delivered reminders of propriety. The standards applied to her were not shared equally across the family. Masako, as the new and foreign-educated princess, was treated as an outsider. Her fluency in English was viewed with suspicion. Her Western education became a liability rather than an asset. Her attempts to modernize certain practices or connect diplomatically with visiting figures were often blocked or discouraged. Even private matters were not spared. The expectation of bearing an heir, specifically a male one, became an unspoken but ever-present mandate. Her body, her schedule, her silences, they all became part of the role she now occupied, one that demanded total surrender to institution over identity. The media amplified the pressure. Japanese tabloids dissected every appearance, speculating on her health, her ability to bear children, a supposed coldness or inaccessibility. Any deviation from public duty was interpreted as weakness. Her limited public appearances were framed not as institutional control, but as personal inadequacy. And the imperial household agency offered no clarification. Their silence fed the narrative that Masako was simply not adjusting. The reality was more complex. Inside the palace, her daily life was defined by isolation. She was not permitted to travel freely. Her outings were carefully timed and tightly scripted. Even her interactions with Crown Prince Naruhito were mediated through the structure of protocol. Visitors were limited, and her correspondence was filtered. Over time, her voice in public settings diminished. The woman once poised to represent Japan on a global stage now stood quietly behind the emperor's son, her presence ornamental, her autonomy dissolved. The internal environment of the palace was not one of overt cruelty, but of quiet containment. Every step was choreographed, every word weighed. Masako began to recede, not from duty, but from visibility. Her early hope that her role could be merged with diplomatic engagement faded. The imperial household did not want innovation. It wanted stability, stillness, and silence. And in demanding those qualities, it began to undo the very foundation on which Masako's identity had been built. Her retreat was not immediate, but it was steady. She began to miss events. Her schedule thinned. She stopped speaking to the press entirely. And when she was seen, she was observed for signs of strain, of failure, of anything that might explain the absence of what the institution had promised. A smiling, obedient, productive consort. But what emerged instead was a woman constrained by systems that saw her as function, not person. In her first years inside the palace, Masako disappeared, not to the world, but to herself. The imperial system did not conceal what it expected from Masako. Her marriage to the crown prince had not only installed her as a consort, it had tasked her, silently but completely, with securing the future of the dynasty through a male child. No law stated this directly, but the message came through in every gesture, every glance from the bureaucracy, every headline from the press. For centuries, the Chrysanthemum Throne had passed almost exclusively through male bloodlines. The birth of a son would not simply fulfill tradition, it would reaffirm it. And so, when months turned into years without an announcement, the scrutiny tightened. The official silence was filled by rumors. Some tabloids speculated about infertility. Others claimed palace doctors were involved in extensive reproductive planning. Masako's appearances began to coincide with speculation over whether she was concealing a pregnancy. Every cancellation became a national headline. Every retreat from public life was interpreted as another failure. Within the walls of the palace, the pressure became invasive. Her body was no longer considered her own. Its rhythms, struggles, and silences were monitored, analyzed, and quietly mourned by a system that measured her worth against her ability to produce a son. Multiple miscarriages were widely suspected, though never confirmed by the palace. Officially, nothing was acknowledged. Unofficially, it was known that Masako had suffered through profound disappointment in private while facing relentless scrutiny in public. The contrast between her previous life, built on professional achievement, and her new role, now reduced to biology, became emotionally devastating. She was expected to smile through ceremonies while enduring physical and psychological tolls behind closed doors. She was not allowed to grieve in public. She was not allowed to speak. Crown Prince Naruhito saw the toll this was taking on her, and in quiet but visible ways, he began to resist. In private, he shielded her where he could. In public, he refused to frame her struggles as failure. Unlike the imperial household agency, he did not view Masako as a symbol of dereliction or disappointment. He saw the cost she was paying. In official events, he often adjusted schedules to limit her exposure. He avoided comments on succession, but his resistance was constrained by the system around him. The agency did not confront him directly, but its expectations were clear. The line of succession had to continue. A boy had to be born. The alternative, elevating a daughter or reforming the succession law, was seen as politically unacceptable. In 2001, after nearly 8 years of marriage, Masako gave birth to a daughter, Princess Aiko. The announcement brought temporary relief. The country celebrated. The media praised Masako for her strength and dignity. But within the palace, celebration was subdued. Aiko's birth did not end the succession crisis. It deepened it. Japan's imperial law, unchanged since 1947, barred women from ascending the throne. Aiko, though cherished by her parents, was not viewed by the institution as a solution. The pressure on Masako did not lift. Talk quickly shifted from celebration to speculation. Would she try again? Could she still produce a son? The palace remained silent. The press did not. And Masako, now a mother, found herself not only managing postpartum recovery and child rearing within the confines of imperial protocol, but also enduring the unspoken message that her daughter had not fulfilled the role that tradition demanded. As her public role narrowed and her emotional strain became more visible, Naruhito's quiet defiance deepened. He remained publicly loyal, standing beside her at state events and shielding her from the most aggressive speculation. He refused to take a concubine, a suggestion whispered in conservative circles. He also refused to press her for another child. His stance was not revolutionary, but it was quietly radical for a future emperor. He chose loyalty to his wife over absolute compliance with the institution. Still, neither his support nor Aiko's birth altered the structural demand that Masako had yet to meet. The expectation remained, unvoiced but total. The crown needed a son. And every year that passed without one pushed Masako further into isolation. In the early years of her marriage, Masako Owada continued to perform her public duties with the composure expected of an imperial consort. She attended ceremonies, greeted dignitaries, and stood beside Crown Prince Naruhito with the practiced grace of someone who understood her role was more observed than lived. But behind the ceremonial gowns and gentle bows, something had begun to erode. The smile she wore at garden parties, state banquets, and imperial rituals had become a mask held in place not by contentment, but by duty. The cultural weight of silent endurance was not new to the imperial family, but Masako had not been raised to surrender herself entirely. Her training had taught her to engage, question, and represent. The palace demanded none of those things. It required stillness, repetition, and the quiet vanishing of self. And over time, the quiet grew louder. Her smile, once automatic, began to flicker. Her posture at events changed. Her responses in brief, controlled interviews became shorter, less expressive, and eventually, her presence faded almost completely. By the early 2000s, Masako had largely withdrawn from public life. Engagements she once attended with regularity now proceeded without her. Invitations to travel abroad were declined. When she did appear, her demeanor seemed distant, and her body language, once fluid and diplomatic, had become visibly tense. The change did not go unnoticed. Japanese media, particularly the weekly tabloids, began to speculate aggressively. They questioned her health, her mental state, her capacity to fulfill her role. Rumors spread about hospitalizations, emotional breakdowns, and internal conflicts with the Imperial Household Agency. The agency itself offered little clarification. Its long-standing policy of avoiding direct commentary allowed speculation to grow unchecked. What should have been a private health matter became a national fixation, one intensified by cultural stigma around mental illness and the rigid expectations placed on imperial women. In 2004, the Imperial Household Agency issued a rare and carefully worded statement. It confirmed that Crown Princess Masako was suffering from what it described as an adjustment disorder. The phrasing was clinical, subdued, and unaccompanied by any direct explanation. But the announcement marked a rare acknowledgement of psychological distress within a family historically shielded from such admissions. For Masako, it was not a vindication. It was exposure. The public now had a name for her absence, but little understanding of its roots. Some commentators expressed sympathy. Others accused her of weakness or resistance. A few questioned whether someone so fragile should have been allowed to marry into the monarchy in the first place. Lost in the noise was the deeper truth, that Masako's withdrawal was not a failure of personality, but a predictable response to sustained pressure, institutional rigidity, and isolation without recourse. Her absence had professional consequences as well. Before marriage, Masako had been widely seen as one of Japan's most promising diplomats. Her multilingual fluency, international education, and policy expertise had made her a standout in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Her career trajectory had suggested ambassadorship, possibly even senior leadership. That future was now unreachable, not because of personal failure, but because the imperial role denied any opportunity to pursue it. The same skills that had once defined her were now dormant, locked behind palace walls. In a system where women were expected to support quietly, produce heirs, and remain emotionally neutral, there was no space for a woman whose identity had once depended on intellectual and diplomatic engagement. And for Masako, the loss of that identity deepened the psychological toll. Throughout this period, Naruhito remained outwardly composed, but those closest to the couple noted the strain. He adjusted his own schedule to accommodate her absence. He shielded their daughter, Aiko, from excessive media attention. He refused to allow Masako's condition to be used as justification for removing her from the public role entirely, even as pressure mounted. Still, the palace culture did not shift. The Imperial Household Agency continued to operate under the same codes, same expectations, and same reluctance to adapt. For Masako, the choice was not between presence and absence. It was between surrender and survival. And so she vanished, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Not to escape attention, but to reclaim a small space in which she could still exist. On December 1st, 2001, Masako gave birth to a daughter, Princess Aiko. For a brief moment, the atmosphere around the imperial family softened. The public rejoiced. Media coverage shifted to celebration. After years of scrutiny and speculation, Masako had delivered a child. It was, for many, a long-awaited affirmation that the imperial line would continue. But the sense of relief was short-lived. Aiko was a girl, and in the eyes of the Imperial Household Agency, that fact held more weight than her arrival itself. The 1947 Imperial Household Law, enacted under post-war reforms, permitted only males to ascend the Chrysanthemum Throne. No woman, regardless of lineage, could rule. Aiko's birth reignited a dormant issue, the succession crisis. At the time, the imperial family had no male heirs in the younger generation. The line of succession narrowed alarmingly, and Aiko, despite her blood, despite her position, was not considered a viable solution. Masako's joy as a new mother quickly met the cold indifference of a system bound to precedent. The child she had carried through a high-risk pregnancy, under public observation, was being treated not as a future sovereign, but as a pause in a deeper crisis. The public, more flexible than the palace, began to question whether it was time to consider a female emperor. Historical precedent existed. Japan had seen empresses in earlier centuries, and the modern world had moved past such restrictions in many monarchies abroad. Political debate followed. In 2005, Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi launched a panel to explore the possibility of revising the succession law. Public opinion polls showed support for the idea. It appeared that change was not only possible, but imminent. But just as the momentum built, it was halted. In 2006, Prince Akishino's wife, Princess Kiko, gave birth to a son, Prince Hisahito. The debate ended. The political will to reform vanished. The boy, now second in line to the throne, reset the narrative. Aiko was no longer the symbol of continuity. She became a symbol of contingency, quickly replaced by a male relative. For Masako, this shift marked another deepening of institutional isolation. Aiko was her child, her only child, and Masako had no intention of allowing her to be consumed by the same pressures. From early on, she became fiercely protective. The princess's public appearances were limited. Press coverage was tightly managed. Even within the palace, Masako ensured that Aiko's upbringing would not follow the same narrow path. She exposed her to books, languages, and ideas that extended beyond the imperial tradition. But that protectiveness brought new friction. As Aiko grew older, speculation began to circulate about her emotional well-being and schooling. When she missed extended periods of school in 2010, media outlets speculated on psychological issues, bullying, and family dynamics. The Imperial Household Agency offered little explanation. Masako's absence from major events during this time reignited earlier criticisms. Again, she was cast as emotionally unstable, as an obstacle to tradition, as someone unable or unwilling to fulfill her role. But the narrative missed what was changing. Masako, once passive under scrutiny, had shifted into a quieter form of resistance. In protecting Aiko, she was asserting a form of agency the palace had never intended her to exercise. She rejected complete compliance with ceremonial expectation. She refused to allow her daughter to be consumed by the institution in the same way she had been. Within the bounds of imperial protocol, she carved out small spaces of control in education, in daily life, in emotional care. These were not political acts in the conventional sense, but they were radical within the context of the imperial family. Masako, once seen as broken by the system, was now negotiating with it, not publicly, not defiantly, but persistently. The palace did not yield. Aiko's status remained unchanged. She was praised, admired, and studied, but not considered. Her future, like her mother's past, was defined by what the law refused to imagine. But within that constraint, Masako had done what the system could not. She had raised a daughter, not as a symbol, but as a person. And in doing so, she had begun to recover parts of herself. In May 2004, Crown Prince Naruhito stood before the press during a royal tour in Europe and made a statement that no one in the Japanese imperial family had ever dared to utter in public. He spoke of his wife, of the years of pressure, of her struggle. He said plainly that Masako's health had been harmed by her efforts to adapt to life in the imperial family, and that she had been constrained from using her career and personality to their fullest extent. The words were careful, but the message was not. It was a direct rebuke of the imperial household agency, and in a system built on silence, obedience, and ritual control, it was a rupture. Masako herself had not spoken publicly in months. Her illness, officially described as an adjustment disorder, remained undefined in human terms. But here was Naruhito, stoic, mild, born into centuries of restraint, speaking out not as heir to the throne, but as a husband. The effect was immediate. In Japan, his words were broadcast repeatedly, analyzed for subtext, parsed for political meaning. The agency, caught off guard, released a bland and vague response. It neither accepted blame nor denied the charge. But the damage, or the truth, had already settled into public view. This was not the first time that observers had questioned the role of the imperial household agency in Masako's retreat from public life. But until Naruhito's words, the speculation had remained one-sided. The press filled the silence with assumptions. Now, the silence was broken by someone inside. The prince's statement forced the public to acknowledge that Masako's disappearance was not a flaw of character, but the result of sustained institutional rigidity. It marked the first time in living memory that a senior member of the imperial family had publicly challenged the agency that managed their lives. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Naruhito and the agency became strained. His growing dissatisfaction had long been noted, but now it was exposed. His defense of Masako was not performative. It was rooted in years of watching her retreat, year by year, under the weight of ceremonial expectations and biological demands. The agency itself had no political accountability. It operated under the cabinet office, but with little oversight. Its task was not to innovate or care, but to preserve. And that preservation came at human cost. Naruhito's defiance was quiet by political standards, but significant within the narrow boundaries of imperial life. It reframed the public understanding of Masako's absence. She was no longer just the princess who had disappeared. She was the woman driven to the margins by a system too rigid to accommodate her. Her silence, long interpreted as weakness, now reflected something else entirely: the effect of institutional neglect. Naruhito did not speak again in such terms for some time. The statement stood alone, unresolved, but its meaning lingered. Within the imperial family, the response was muted. There was no open split, no confrontation, but the tone shifted. Masako's public appearances remained rare, but their absence was now understood differently. Her illness was no longer treated as a personal failure. It was a visible reminder of a system's limits. The media, though not universally sympathetic, began to reflect a more nuanced understanding. Masako, without speaking, had become a symbol, not of resistance, but of institutional strain. Her image, once used to promote a modern monarchy, now exposed its fractures. For Naruhito, the statement marked a turning point. He did not withdraw it, he did not soften it, but he also did not escalate. His method remained consistent: protect quietly, act slowly, and preserve the line while shielding the woman the system could not. His marriage, now over a decade old, was no longer framed in romantic terms by the public. It was something else, more enduring, more serious. It was the only visible challenge to an agency that claimed to preserve tradition but failed to protect the people inside it. And through his words, Masako's absence was no longer a mystery. It was a verdict. After years of near-total seclusion, Crown Princess Masako began to return, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with quiet calculation. Her reappearance was gradual, beginning with short appearances at imperial rituals, followed by carefully selected public engagements. The woman once considered absent or broken was now visibly composed, but not unchanged. Her demeanor was more restrained, her gaze more steady, her movements measured. What had once been dismissed as fragility was now read more carefully as control. Masako was no longer performing the role expected of her in full. She was adjusting it. Her return was not a restoration. It was a quiet redefinition. Her public schedule remained limited. The Imperial Household Agency maintained the same protocols, but Masako's presence began to defy the passive image the agency had once tried to cultivate. She did not resume the full slate of duties assigned to consorts in previous generations. She chose appearances that aligned with education, culture, and diplomacy, areas that reflected her pre-marriage identity. These selections were not overtly political, but they suggested preference, boundaries, and self-possession. When she attended events related to children's welfare or international exchange, she did so with the bearing of someone informed, not ornamental. She engaged with foreign visitors in multiple languages. She stood beside Naruhito, not behind him. The difference was subtle but consistent. Her relationship with Aiko remained central. Masako's protectiveness did not waver. During public appearances, she often stood close to her daughter, adjusting her pace to match, limiting exposure when needed. At school, ceremonies, and family outings, her body language made clear that Aiko's well-being came first. Even when palace tradition might have demanded greater separation between child and consort, Masako maintained closeness. Her insistence on shielding Aiko from the same pressures that had nearly consumed her was unwavering. In doing so, she signaled a form of resistance, not loud, not confrontational, but deliberate. She would not allow her daughter to be shaped solely by the expectations of the institution. Her attire remained formal, but she carried herself with a calm assertiveness that contrasted with earlier years. Her smiles were softer, less frequent, and more complex. In photographs, her expressions no longer conveyed obligation, they suggested containment. There was no longer any effort to appear exuberant or eager. there was no need. The public, once curious and critical, responded to her reappearance with cautious respect. Opinion polls showed rising support for her. Coverage began to frame her not as a disappointment, but as a survivor of a system slow to evolve. Within the palace, her re-emergence was accepted, though not necessarily embraced. The agency continued to manage her schedule tightly, but the narrative had shifted. Masako was no longer a liability to be hidden. She was a figure to be watched, quietly, and with greater caution. Every appearance became symbolic. Each engagement was not simply ceremonial, it was interpretive. Was she smiling more? Was she walking with confidence? Was she speaking in full sentences? Analysts and commentators began to study her presence as much as her absence. But Masako did not explain herself. She offered no statements. She gave no interviews. Her method of return was not accompanied by any narrative. It was a series of controlled visual gestures that told a story without words. In those moments, she made it clear that she was not returning to be what the palace had wanted. She was returning on her own terms, as someone who had endured, recalibrated, and chosen to re-enter. The institution remained unchanged in structure, but not untouched. Her survival had revealed its limits. Her silence had forced questions, and now her return exposed a different kind of challenge, not to power, but to precedent. Masako did not bow as easily as before. She no longer bent entirely to the scripts that had defined her early years. She had endured the roles forced upon her, but she no longer allowed them to define her completely. Each step into the public eye now carried the memory of her absence and the quiet strength it had taken to come back. In April 2019, Emperor Akihito formally abdicated the Chrysanthemum Throne, the first Japanese emperor to do so in over 2 centuries. His departure marked not only the end of the Heisei era, but the beginning of something unspoken for Masako. With Akihito's quiet exit, Crown Prince Naruhito became emperor, and beside him stood the woman the system had tried for years to silence, correct, and reshape. Masako, after decades of containment, was now Empress of Japan. Her ascension was not marked by a dramatic transformation. There was no reinvention, no public declaration of new beginnings. Instead, there was a coronation rooted in the same protocols, rituals, and ceremony that had long governed the imperial household. But Masako's presence within that framework was different. It carried the full weight of survival, not a conquest of the system, but a refusal to be erased by it. The enthronement ceremony, held in October that year, followed traditional lines. The regalia was displayed, speeches were made, state officials attended, and Masako, in formal court attire, stood composed and still beside the new emperor. There was no sign of defiance in her posture, but there was no submission either. Her presence, long doubted and often dismissed, was now fully sanctioned. The institution that once struggled to contain her had elevated her, because it had no other choice. The role of Empress, like all imperial roles, was defined by visibility and silence. But this time, those watching did so with greater awareness. Masako was no longer seen as a fragile consort. Her years of absence had become part of her image. Her reappearance was not interpreted as full recovery, but as the result of endurance. The political system around the throne had also changed. Japan's leadership remained conservative, and the imperial household agency continued to guard its authority, but the monarchy's image had softened under Emperor Akihito's reign. His public gestures after natural disasters, his expressions of empathy had redefined what symbolic leadership could look like in post-war Japan. Masako's role under Emperor Naruhito now extended from that foundation. She was not expected to lead, but her visibility now held meaning. At state dinners and diplomatic functions, she resumed her work with language, protocol, and presence. Foreign guests noted her fluency and ease in international settings. Japanese audiences saw a woman more comfortable in public, but more reserved than before. Her expressions were measured, her posture practiced, but they now reflected someone who had endured loss, scrutiny, and confinement without vanishing. Within the imperial household, nothing was rewritten. The system did not offer apology or reform. The expectations for male succession remained unchanged. The agency maintained its grip on scheduling and appearances. But Masako's survival and her return was itself a quiet indictment of the structure's inflexibility. She had not become the modernizing figure some had hoped for in the 1990s, nor had she become the symbol of collapse others had feared in the 2000s. She had become something harder to define, a reminder of the human cost embedded in tradition, and a presence shaped not by ceremony but by absence. Observers continued to debate her role. Some viewed her as a restored figure. Others saw her as a silent lesson in restraint. But beneath those interpretations was a simple truth. She had been subjected to a system that treated her body as a vessel, her mind as a liability, and her silence as necessity. And she had outlasted all of it. Now seated beside the emperor, she embodied not triumph, but quiet continuity. A continuity that did not begin with her and would not end with her, but which now carried her imprint, faint, deliberate, and enduring. Her rise had not broken the institution, but it had exposed its limits. And in doing so, it had made her presence impossible to ignore. Princess Aiko was born into contradiction. As the only child of Emperor Naruhito and Empress Masako, she was surrounded by affection within the walls of the palace, yet legally excluded from the future it represented. From the beginning, her presence stirred quiet tension. The nation welcomed her with celebration in 2001, but the system into which she was born did not see her as a solution. The imperial household law remained unchanged, written to exclude women from the line of succession, regardless of merit, character, or birthright. Aiko was never promised the throne. She was born into its shadow, cherished by her parents, but erased by the law. And yet, through childhood and adolescence, she observed the world that made her both central and peripheral. She saw what her mother endured. She saw what her father protected. And she learned how to exist within a structure that had no place for her. Masako's most sustained act of quiet defiance became her role as a mother. Within the narrow space allowed by imperial tradition, she shielded Aiko from overexposure. She preserved her daughter's privacy in a culture that consumed royal imagery with hunger. From school events to family appearances, Masako shaped the terms of Aiko's visibility. She did not raise her daughter to be compliant to an institution that had denied her legitimacy. She raised her to observe, to understand, and to endure without erasure. As a result, Aiko's public image remained modest but constant. She was rarely the subject of controversy, but always a point of interest. Her voice was never quoted. her opinions never reported. But she remained in sight, growing slowly into a figure who represented both tradition and its unspoken tensions. In 2022, Aiko reached the age of majority. The imperial household marked the occasion with a formal coming-of-age ceremony, a rite performed for generations of royals. She received a grand cordon of the Order of the Precious Crown, wore formal attire for the press, and delivered her first remarks in the careful language prescribed by imperial custom. Her words were brief and safe. She pledged to perform her duties sincerely. But the moment held deeper meaning. It was not simply the passage from girlhood to adulthood. It was a public confirmation that the nation was watching someone it could not name as heir, but could not forget. Her calm, composed presence was received with quiet admiration. Polls continued to show public support for female succession. Yet the law remained firm, and Aiko, raised in full awareness of her symbolic place, made no gesture toward challenging it. Her education reflected the values of both her parents. She enrolled at Gakushuin University, the traditional school for aristocracy, focusing on Japanese literature. She participated in online classes during the pandemic, submitted essays, and earned praise for academic seriousness. Her teachers described her as attentive and modest. The media, still bound by limits in reporting on imperial children, noted her maturity and politeness. But beneath these surface descriptions was a larger reality. Aiko had become the embodiment of a path not taken, a future carefully prepared, yet structurally denied. Her manner echoed her father's restraint and her mother's endurance. She carried herself with an awareness of visibility, but without performance. She had learned from watching. Masako's influence remained evident, not in bold gestures, but in posture, in boundaries, in presence. She had raised Aiko to be fluent in silence, but not shaped by it. The girl who once walked nervously beside her mother now stood without prompting. And though her name was absent from succession lists, it remained in the public mind. Her image was steady, her appearances deliberate. She had become a reference point, not just for what a future empress might look like, but for what an institution continued to deny. Aiko's existence did not challenge the monarchy openly, but it reminded the country and the agency that governed it that exclusion did not erase presence. She had been raised inside the oldest system in Japan, but her bearing belonged to a quieter lineage, one of women who had endured, adapted, and watched. Empress Masako never sat on the throne as ruler. She never issued an edict, never wielded political power, never led a nation in her name. But she became one of the most consequential figures to pass through the inner gates of the Japanese monarchy, not by force, but by surviving what the institution quietly demanded of her. From the moment she entered the imperial household, she was expected to shrink, to step away from her identity, her profession, her fluency in the outside world, and become a symbol of compliance wrapped in silk. Her background in diplomacy, her international education, her multilingual skill, all once hailed as marks of progress, became liabilities inside a system allergic to change. She was not destroyed, but she was silenced, not punished, but isolated, not overthrown, but overwritten. And yet she remained. Her survival was not linear. It came at a cost, measured not in dramatic episodes, but in years. Years in which her health deteriorated, her autonomy vanished, and her very presence became politicized. She was diagnosed, criticized, and nearly erased, while still appearing in official rosters. Her absence was treated as aberration. Her motherhood became conditional. Her marriage, romanticized by the public, was in truth a tightly sealed partnership shaped by restraint and quiet defense. Masako lived inside a structure that did not allow women to lead and barely allowed them to exist beyond the ornamental. In a monarchy that had only rarely recognized female rulers, and only long in the past, she was neither crowned nor completely dismissed. Her status was official. Her power was not. But over time, and without confrontation, Masako's presence reshaped what it meant to stand beside the emperor. Her reappearances after years of illness were not grand comebacks. They were carefully paced gestures of resilience. Her role remained ceremonial, but the way she moved within it shifted the tone. When she engaged with diplomats in fluent English or delivered remarks in her own words, she reminded the institution of the person they had nearly buried under protocol. When she shielded her daughter from the harshest edges of the succession crisis, she enacted a form of maternal resistance. She did not fight tradition directly, but she exposed its cost by living through it. Her silence became a mirror, reflecting the weight of a system that preferred its women quiet, compliant, and useful only through reproduction. The cost of compliance, for Masako, was not invisible. It was carried in her decades-long withdrawal from the public eye, in the medical diagnosis that named but did not relieve her suffering, and in the endless public speculation that treated her health like an obstacle to state function. Her refusal to fully vanish, however, became its own strategy. She did not denounce the monarchy. She did not depart. She remained, and in remaining, she endured. And endurance, within a palace that valued image over adaptation, became its own kind of challenge. Her intelligence, once the hallmark of her diplomatic promise, became a burden in a court that valued stillness over thought. The imperial system had long prized women who could support the throne without casting shadows over it. But Masako's mind was not silent. Her career had been shaped around negotiation, analysis, and presence in the world. The system offered none of those things, and in resisting through stillness, in refusing to fully become what was asked of her, she created a space for something else, something uncertain, but undeniable. Her legacy, unlike her titles, cannot be clearly defined. She did not transform the institution from within, but she revealed its limits by refusing to disappear inside them. Today, Empress Masako continues to perform her duties with composure, accompanied by an emperor who chose her and defended her. She appears in state ceremonies, receives foreign dignitaries, and walks the same polished floors that once confined her. But her smile now carries the weight of what was lost, not just for her, but for every woman the monarchy declined to see in full. She did not break the throne, she did not remake it, but she stood beside it long enough for the cracks to show. Her story is not one of triumph. It is one of survival, a slow, painful assertion of existence in a system that prized symbols over selves. And in that quiet assertion, she became something the agency could not fully control, a living contradiction. A woman with a mind in a place that did not ask her to think. A mother in a system that rejected her daughter's future. A consort whose silence became the loudest indictment of all. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?